It's a great privilege to be with you and to join this distinguished panel for a discussion on this institution and its future. It is a seminal moment. No one need remind anyone in this room of that and this institution of that fact, because the need for the United Nations has never been greater in world events, world commerce, and in human events. It is a seminal moment because the United Nations and its member states have the opportunity to determine whether the United Nations will live up to its founding, whether it will re-energize itself, find the will and the capacity and the character to live up to the promise that so many millions, indeed billions of people around the world are depending upon this institution to fulfill. To that end, what this institution is capable of doing in terms of charting a new course for the institution, in terms of the character that it will present to the world, in terms of the efficiency, the transparency, and the high standards with which it was born, and will now even raise further, are absolutely critical to its success and indeed to the global community. And what happens in this institution and the way in which its future is charted will determine in large measure whether there is something that we can honestly, truthfully, and faithfully call a world community. I personally see it as that profound, that important, and for that reason we thank you for being here to join in this discussion. And I would like to begin by introducing our panel members who will be addressing the issues that are confronting this institution. First, Richard Williamson, who is a partner in the international law firm of Mayer Brown, Rowe, and Law. His government experience includes serving as assistant to the President for Intergovernmental Affairs for Ronald Reagan, ambassador to the United Nations offices in Vienna, assistant secretary of state for international operations, ambassador to the United Nations for special political affairs, ambassador to the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, and most recently, member of the panel of eminent persons on strengthening the effectiveness of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Daniel Hutka is Vice President for Foreign and Defense Policies at the American Enterprise Institute. Her research areas include the Middle East, including Iran, Iraq, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, South Asia, India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, global terrorism and weapons proliferation. While at AEI, Ms. Hutka has developed a conference series on rebuilding post-Saddam Iraq, a project on democracy for the Arab world, a roundtable of experts to discuss global energy security, and a project to develop bilateral relations between India and the United States, and most recently serving as a member of the congressionally mandated task force on the United Nations. Blanca Jikic is currently Deputy Director of Strategic Planning at CSIS, where she helps to lead the Center's relationships with corporations and foundations. Also a fellow of the Hills Program on Governance, and his work on governance in the context of UN management reform, foreign assistance issues, and corporate governance reform in Southeast Asia. And Roderick Hills is partner of Hills Stern and Moreland, founder and chairman of the Hills Program on Governance at CSIS, a leading advocate, of course, for effective corporate governance, the co-chairman of the Committee of Economic Development. He has a long and distinguished career that includes both service in the public sector, counsel to the President of the United States, chairman of the Securities Exchange Commission, and in the private sector, founder and partner of Munger, Tulls & Hills in Los Angeles. So with that, we have an august group of thought leaders and public servants to share their views. And Rich Williamson, if I may ask you to begin.
Thank you. I want to thank Ambassador Bolton for suggesting this panel, and it's good to see a number of former colleagues and friends, and especially want to thank my former colleague Patsy Agee for being here and Lou Dobbs for moderating. As you gather this afternoon, there are those who say the UN is a morally bankrupt institution due to double standards and broken promises. There are those who charge that UN mismanagement is so rampant with fraud, waste, and abuse that it cannot be fixed. There are those prepared to turn their backs on the UN and cavalierly walk away. I reject such a view. The UN is a very useful institution. The UN Charter embraces the same values upon which America was founded: human rights, self-determination, the rule of law, opportunity for all. Today and every day, millions of people around the world benefit from the UN's many programs and activities. The poor, the sick, the hungry, the weak who are victims of repression, those caught in cycles of senseless war, those victims of ethnic cleansing and genocide. Having visited UN political and peacekeeping missions in Afghanistan, Ethiopia and Eritrea, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Sierra Leone, Bosnia and Kosovo, and most recently Liberia, to name but a few, I know firsthand that the UN is contributing to peace and security around the world. And now, as the international community tries to address the grave and growing danger of Iran's nuclear program, the UN's International Atomic Energy Agency initially, and with last week's referral, the UN Security Council, are the instruments of choice for the U.S. and the world to try to deal diplomatically with this growing menace. Clearly, the UN is useful, but like all institutions, the UN also has problems, very serious problems. Problems that weaken the UN and in some cases cripple it. Some are first and foremost the result of member states' misbehavior. Some are caused by UN structures, procedures, and processes. Some are due to management that lacks transparency, lacks independent oversight, lacks accountability, and lacks management flexibility. To ignore the desperate need for UN reform is to allow the UN promise to blind you to its debilitating weaknesses. To allow entrenched interest to prevent reform is to allow fear of change to stand in the way of renewal required for the UN to thrive and contribute to a better world. To fail to act on common sense management and budget reforms is to deepen the divide between donor and recipient states, to hamstring the Secretary General, and to limit the UN's effectiveness and reach. To fail to act boldly to reform the UN will relegate this noble institution to a twilight of decline. No one will benefit from such inaction. Those people who will be harmed most are those who are poor, sick, oppressed, victims of cycles of violence. Those countries who will suffer are those less mighty, less strong, with less reach, for whom the UN is more central to their interests than those with great military might, economic strength, and vast cultural reach, for whom the UN is less central. In the area of management reform, the UN has taken some worthy steps on accountability, including creating an ethics office and disclosure requirements covering more people at different levels and more activities and gifts. Next, the UN has to follow through with creating an independent audit advisory committee to validate the work of the OIOS and external auditors and recommend proper levels of funding and staff for those oversight functions. Also, the Secretary General should be given more leeway in hiring to move beyond current restrictions on geographic considerations. The Secretary General also should be given flexibility to move people and posts. Regarding mandates, early next month, the Secretary General is scheduled to make a report on mandates 5 years old or more to review. Drawing upon this report, the member states should make serious, tangible reallocation decisions. Funds should be shifted from lower priorities to higher priorities, for example, from conferences and reports to actual technical assistance to help developing countries. Let me now turn to human rights. Human rights issues go to the core values of the United Nations, its highest aspirations and greatest opportunities. Human rights go to the heart and soul and mission of the UN. Respect for human rights is in the Charter to which all member states subscribe in theory, if not always in practice. The UN Universal Declaration on Human Rights and subsequent UN documents have established fundamental norms reflected in national constitution and laws around the world. These rights are fundamental, inalienable, and transcendent. And respect for human rights contribute, indeed, are central to maintaining international peace and security. For as George Marshall pointed out over 55 years ago,
Countries that respect the human rights of their own citizens are more likely to respect the rights of other countries. They are less likely to engage in foreign adventurism. The UN Commission on Human Rights has failed in its responsibilities. At that forum, many of the world's most brutal oppressors escape rebuke. It is embarrassing. It is shameful. It brings dishonor on the UN. And most important, it fails the oppressed, the repressed, the victims of human rights to whom we all have a responsibility, particularly the UN. As Mark Malloch Brown has said, for the great global public, the performance or non-performance of the Human Rights Commission has become the litmus test for UN renewal. The UN Forum to Address Human Rights is not just another UN organ for regional rotation for business as usual. It is more than that. It is more fundamental. It is loftier. It goes to the heart and soul of the UN. It goes to UN member states' responsibilities and opportunities to themselves, to the UN, and to the victims of human rights. Those countries that fail in their responsibilities to respect the rights of their own citizens should not, cannot be allowed to sit in judgment of others. The time for UN reform and renewal is now. Nowhere is it more necessary than in the UN's human rights mechanisms. If not here, where can the UN achieve meaningful reform? If not now, when? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Daniel Plecker.
Good afternoon, everybody. Let me also thank the U.S. mission for arranging this very timely conference, and John Bolton, who used to work at AEI, so I have a special feeling for him, and Mr. Dobbs for moderating, and you all for coming. I'm impressed with the number of people who are here, impressed and amazed, frankly. We're talking about management reform issues. If you look at the last year, what you see is a United Nations in crisis. It's a little bit like a movie, and the United Nations has come in and out of crisis over its history. There have been moments of great self-searching. There have been any number of UN reform commissions. The first one, I believe, was in 1946. They come and go on an annual basis. It's almost always a crisis, and the United Nations is in extremis. It's a little bit like a horror movie. The United Nations is the thing that comes back up from the bathtub and leaps out just after you thought it was dead. And I think that the problem is that we fail to recognize that while there are perhaps any number of subsequent resuscitations that could come, the failure to address the central problems of the United Nations has allowed the institution to crumble from within. We have another moment now where we have seen the last year of great crisis. We've seen the 60th anniversary and nations coming together, agreeing for reform, and we have seen a total loss of momentum in that reform. What you will see in the media, what you will hear from people, is that things like the referral of Iran from the International Atomic Energy Agency to the United Nations Security Council are yet another endorsement of the institution and the value of the institution. What I would say is this: these are nothing other than breathers that are given to the institution that allow time for reform to slip backwards. In fact, it does not endorse the value of the institution if the institution and everything else it does outside the Security Council is ineffective. And the grander issues really must be addressed. Excuse me one second. I'm sorry, I have a horrible cold. The grander issues really must be addressed. The bureaucratic ineffectiveness, and fundamentally, the failure to deliver to the people who look to the United Nations. It is not the United States or the people of the United States that look to the UN for salvation. We can manage on our own. We and the other Perm 5 and the rest of the Perm 5 can manage on our own. It is the people of Sudan, the people of Congo, the people of Rwanda, the people of Bosnia, these people who are looking to the United Nations, and we And I say we decidedly. We have all failed them. Last year's frenzy of blue ribbon commissions, one of which I served on with Rod Hills, notwithstanding, real reform is not in the offing. It has been blocked by countries that are addicted to the entitlements that they receive from the United Nations, and by professional naysayers within the organization and groups of naysayers that wish to block any meaningful change. Don't think that you're hurting us. You're not. You're hurting the very people who you are meant to be serving. There are imperative changes in structure and in management that have allowed millions of dollars to be stolen or misused. Those are not millions of dollars that have been taken from the employees of the United Nations. These are millions of dollars that have been taken from the people of Iraq, from the people of Timor, from the victims of the tsunami. This is real. It does have real implications. And there is an atmosphere of impunity that pervades the institution. So what you see is that when someone is called on the misuse of funds, there is a general outrage that arises from employees, from member states, from those self-same entitlement hogs of the United Nations, that people should be called to account for misusing this money. I hate to quote Bob Dole, but where is the outrage? There should be outrage at such things, where in fact there is a culture of impunity that extends not just from the office of the Secretary General, where his own Chief of Staff felt comfortable in shredding thousands of documents that he had only recently ordered the rest of his staff to preserve, down to peacekeepers in the Congo who feel comfortable in running prostitution rings and extortion rings and drug rings because they won't be called to account, because they won't be prosecuted. Surely that should excite some outrage in all of us. There have been other failures institutionally in management that I think our other speakers are going to talk about in more detail. But there is not just organizational rot inside the United Nations, there's policy rot as well. You heard Ambassador Williamson talk about the Human Rights Commission. This is an embarrassment. Surely we should be able to agree upon a successor to what exists right now. The fact that we are incapable of doing so is an embarrassment to everybody. The fact that we have been incapable of agreeing on a definition of terrorism is something that should embarrass us all. Terrorism is not only directed at the United States. Need I remind people of those Jordanians who were recently blown up at a wedding? Muslims are the main victims of Muslim Islamic extremist terrorism. There must be a definition that we all agree on, because once we agree, we will act. Without agreement, we will not act effectively. The institution is also mired in the past. It's not just walking around and looking at the plumbing that you have a sense that things were ignored since 1968. There are institutions inside the UN. One particular area I would point to, the focus on Palestinian issues. The United Nations is engaged in the Quartet, which has embraced the roadmap, which is a way forward for the Palestinians and the Israelis to agree with each other on a partnership that will create two states. Meanwhile, at the United Nations, there is, forgive me if I refer to my list, I don't know this from memory, a committee on the exercise of the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people, which, by the way, is not interested in the inalienable rights of the Israeli people. A committee on the question of Palestine. A UN special coordinator for the Middle East peace process. There is, of course, UNRWA, which is dedicated to Palestinian refugees, but there are also special employees costing thousands and hundreds of thousands of dollars inside the UN Conference on Trade and Development, devoted only to this issue, inside the Economic and Social Development Commission in Western Asia, inside the Special Committee to investigate Israeli practices affecting human rights of the Palestinian people, inside the Human Rights Advisory and Technical Cooperation Committee, and in the Department of Public Information on information activities on the question of Palestine. Surely there are some other people who deserve recognition. Surely these institutions deserve some review. I picked this issue, by the way, because it is so emblematic of how the United Nations has remained mired in the past, failed to move forward, failed to review, failed to sunset. It's not just a problem of Palestinians, it's a problem of so many different committees. I want to make two last points. One is to remember that, like the United Nations Development Program, which has moved to all voluntary contributions, and like Mark Malloch Brown, who has an understanding of the importance of competition, the United States has started to look at the United Nations and recognize that there are areas in which the United Nations is not going to be useful to us, and we are going to work through NATO, or we are going to work through the OSCE, or we are going to work in ad hoc multilateral partnerships like the Proliferation Security Initiative. All that means is that we are not working through the United Nations. For people who believe in the value of the institution, that is not good for the institution. And now a last point as we look forward. This is Secretary General Annan's last year in office. The process of choosing a new Secretary General has already begun. It's not a particularly seemly or attractive process, but it is imbued with the same entitlement mentality that brings meaning to so many other activities here. A regional grouping feels that it should have the next Secretary Generalship. We know who the candidates are. I don't want to speak to any of their merits, but shouldn't we be looking for someone with the merits of a chief executive? Someone who knows how to manage an institution such as the United Nations, somebody who has proven management ability, someone who has proven integrity. Isn't that the set of criteria that we want to use when we choose the next Secretary General, rather than saying, no, what I really want is a Thai or a Sri Lankan? I think perhaps the institution deserves better than the process that we have, and with that I'll close. Thank you, Lou.
Daniel Plunkett, thank you. Monica, just before I turn to you, if I may, and just as soon as we get through the panel's remarks, we're going to discuss a few of these, but we're going to invite your questions within a matter of moments of that. So if you would, and there are microphones, I understand, available. Where are the microphones, by the way? There. Thank you for validating my point. Anyway, thank you, and reassuring me at the same time. Blanca, thank you very much.
Thank you, Lou. I want to start by saying how honored I am to be part of this terrific panel today. I'm pleased that the U.S. mission to the UN has decided to convene this important discussion on UN management reforms. I believe that management reforms and institutional change within the UN in general are critical to the integrity and vitality of the organization. Without them, operational changes in other areas are very difficult to implement. I believe that an effective, transparent, and efficient UN is not only in the interest of the United States, but of all other democratic member states. In an increasingly complex world of threats and challenges, the U.S. and its allies must be able to leverage an effective UN as a dependable tool of foreign policy. I want to spend a few minutes on specific management reform issues and recommendations. During an intense 6 months last year, I was part of the bipartisan UN task force led by Speaker Gingrich and Senator Mitchell. The mandate for my group was to study the UN and make recommendations on oversight and management reforms. Over the course of the 6 months, my colleagues, including Rod Hills and I, had the unique opportunity to look inside the UN and its operations. What we found was that many of the management systems that are common in other public and private organizations were lacking in a number of UN agencies and bodies that we studied. I will highlight 3 of our overall recommendations, which appear in the final June 2005 report of the task force. I will follow each with what progress is being made by the UN. First, the creation of an effective chief operating officer responsible for the day-to-day business of running the UN. I believe there has been no concrete move to create a COO position in the spirit of this recommendation. I understand that currently the issue is being discovered within the Secretariat. To me, this should be the easiest change to implement. It's quite simple. Second, effective whistleblower protection, ethics disclosure requirements for top officials. Here, I believe that fair progress has been made, evidenced by the formal establishment of an ethics office and a formal whistleblower protection policy. Finally, a modern personnel system to create a more professionalized and responsive UN. Again, I think progress is fair here through the creation of a management performance board designed to monitor individual offices and managers in a systematic way. I look forward to seeing continued progress on these and many more other management reform issues, particularly in the Secretary General's upcoming progress report, which is due out at the end of this month. I will conclude by saying that I believe the UN has made some strides in the right direction on management and institutional reforms in the past 6 months, but there's still a long way to go. The leadership of the United States and other democratic member states will be crucial to sustaining the momentum of these efforts. Thank you.
Braca, thank you. Rod?
About a year ago, and Danielle and Branca and I, along with Speaker Gingrich and Majority Leader, Mitchell, going to say about a year ago, when we all gathered to begin the study of the United Nations with Speaker Gingrich and the Majority Leader of the Senate, George Mitchell, Tom Pickering, and Don McHenry, 2 former ambassadors, General Wes Clark, they handed out the assignments, weapons of mass destruction, poverty, genocide, management reform. Wes Clark turned to me and said, "You got the boring one." It's the mundane nature of running an organization. I've been a visiting professor at a couple of business schools. I must say to you that any dean of those schools would be astonished if this many people turned out to a school on how to manage a company. It's pretty mundane stuff. And so I guess I have to assume that the reaction to our report has been that something's hidden, some secret agenda must be there. I would have thought that it would be almost beyond dispute to say that a well-managed organization is going to do everything better. And whether it's personnel policies, how to hire good people, how to make good careers for people, how to manage resources, how to allocate resources, how to complete tasks that are assigned, to determine whether they're finished or not. Those are all the sort of things that should be self-evident. And so as we went through our report, I frankly thought it would be an appendix to almost everybody else's report. But the opposition to it is really quite surprising. I'm going to talk just about one part of the report, and that is the need for accountability and oversight. We talk too much about the frauds. Not that they're not important. Oil for food is a terrible scandal. And there are other scandals throughout the world. Europe, we had our Enron, huge accounting scandal. Europe had its Parmalat, even a bigger accounting scandal. Korea had its Daewoo Corporation, another huge accounting scandal. We've all had them. We've had them in nonprofit organizations like Blue Cross and Blue Shield in many parts of the United States, all around the world. And you find at the end of every one of them, everybody said, why don't we have accountability and oversight? Now, the United Nations has some emblems of oversight. You have what I think is a very effective external auditing system. You have the Auditors General of 3 countries, France, South Africa, Philippines, all with good accounting traditions, that oversee a process which in most corporations are done by the Big Four, Price Waterhouse or Coopers or one of the Big Four accounting firms. And that seems to be working pretty well. I mean, they do their job and they issue a report. But they would tell you, if you talk to them quietly, that their ability to give an opinion as to the finances and as to the performance of the United Nations is really quite hampered. In fact, if you looked at international accounting standards, they would say they couldn't give an opinion. Why? Because there are no effective internal controls at the United Nations. There's no effective internal audit at the United Nations. There's very good leadership in the internal audit, just as there's very good leadership in the external audit. But they kind of wander off by themselves. The internal audit gets a budget, and in recent years, the Secretary General has been very anxious to make sure that they do their job. But when you get something like Oil for Food comes along, the United Nations goes hand in hand and says, would you give us some money so we can see whether you're doing it right or not? And they say no, and they say, okay, oh well, we won't, then we'll go do it anyway. So why should anything at the United Nations be done if there's not a proper oversight and proper accountability? And as my prior speakers have said, this really isn't for the United States at all. The United States is big enough, as many other the big companies or countries are, to say, boy, do it our way, and too often we say do it our way or we'll go away. That's a terrible weapon to use, and that's not a nice weapon to use. I don't even like it being used, but it's effective. The smaller countries don't have that weapon. So what do you have? You have accountability, and you have effective oversight. But I mean, that's what you need. You don't have it. If you are able to get the General Assembly to give a task to the United Nations, you have no way of knowing whether that's carried out effectively or efficiently. Don't really have any idea of whether that should be carried out. There's no normal, regular oversight that you'd expect in almost every place in the world, any business organization in the world. In 35 years, I think I've served on 21 boards, spent time with the Securities and Exchange Commission, and you see your share of scandals. I think I've been in 10 corporate train wrecks. At the end of every one of them, whether it's charitable, whether it's non-governmental, or whether it's a business organization, you sit back and you say, they didn't have accountability. They didn't have oversight. As I said again, it's not for fraud. It covers fraud. It's for making the thing work. And so our effort over this past year was to do just that. What happens in an organization? The internal auditor sees somebody selling scrap. And he says, boy, we ought to investigate whether the scrap is being sold at the best price. So he goes to the company CEO and says, I need to have some money to investigate the way we handle scrap. The guy that handles scrap, perhaps a decent guy, perhaps a crooked person, goes to the CEO and says, are you kidding? I'm a good guy. I've done a job all these years, no scandal. Why should we waste corporate money on that? The CEO then, maybe he wants to make a few cents more for his financial report, may say, do it or not do it. The internal auditor may be right. The CEO may be right. But the fact is there is no independent oversight of that unless you have some independent oversight board, some capacity to make that decision. So what have we proposed? Looking at the fact that the external audit of the United Nations has worked well, we've said let's have an independent oversight board that has the same capacity. Let's find 3 directors general of 3 other countries to manage this, and maybe add 1 or 2 very respected finance ministers who will sit there and be a referee, an arbitrator. So if the internal auditor says, I need this to do, and the CEO or the manager says, don't do it, that independent body can do it. The General Assembly will have to elect those 3 people, just as they elect the Board of External Auditors. And there will be an effective capacity to do the job right. The next time the Oil for Food function type problem comes to the United Nations, the United Nations should say, okay, it's going to cost $5 million to give it proper oversight and auditing. And they say, no, we just want you to manage it, we don't want you to audit it. The United Nations should say, our reputation is too important, we won't waste it. If you won't let us audit it, we're not going to do it. Let me conclude by saying what I started with. This isn't for fraud alone. This isn't for the big countries. It's to make sure that the money spent is spent on the projects that want to be spent, that it's neither stolen nor wasted, and that you don't have these kinds of scandals that embarrass us all. Our effort in our report last year was to convince the Congress of the United States, as well as the United States itself, the people, that the United Nations is important, terribly important in the United States, terribly important to all the countries in the world, and we just want to make it work better. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Let me ask both you, Branka and Rod, since you, as General Wes Clark put it, you had the dull, I believe, part of the agenda. The fact is that it is at the heart of what must be changed in order for true reform to take place. One of my great friends and mentors, Walt Wriston, who knew something about international organization, once said that bureaucracy is a state of mind. And through organizational change, through structural change, you can address state of mind to some degree. But at what point do you think you will, is there a sufficient foundation now to change the state of mind at the United Nations, and is there a sufficient energy around that to create true reform?